So these are the results for group number 3. We started with 3 different questions: how to identify needs, how to measure needs, and finding alternatives for the utility function. So in terms of how to measure needs, we define that it's important to have a comprehensive method considering a qualitative and quantitative perspective. The qualitative identifying as a first step for informing the quantitative methods, and the quantitative methods helping to inform the qualitative ones. So in this idea of more comprehensive methods and more room for self-expression in existing tools, and at the same time a different way of asking for the current tools that we have. So the idea at the end is to find alternatives for the utility function. And we think that this is important because the utility goes for the majority of people, of needs. So the utility function at the end treats everyone in the same way, while we should start embracing the diversity and the pluralism. In this idea of diversity and pluralism, we discuss a lot about also other kind of important concepts as democracy. But the idea is to say that this diversification of needs are for different groups with different needs that participate in the society. So we're considering that people has their personal needs, and those personal needs are coinciding between individuals, but at the same time these individuals are participating in collective and segments of society. So these societal values at the same time are coinciding between them, and sometimes are conflicting between them. So the work of the transport planner at the end is to recognize these kind of particularities and these kind of needs, both for personal and collective segments. So what we think is that we should recognize what are these needs. And for doing this, we describe that there are different needs. The achieved needs, that it's what people is actually doing, and the uncovered needs, that is what people is missing today. So in the relation between these two, there are some gaps that need to be filled, and some thresholds that we also need to recognize. And for that, and the question is to whom? What are the beneficiaries of this? In a collective perspective and a personal perspective.
So in our working group, we focus on the vulnerable population group of elderly. And for this, we considered a case study in Sweden, looking at 3 different cities. So we considered the following analytical framework for it. So first of all, we looked at the vulnerable users, which were, in our case, elderly people, so 75 years old plus. Then we looked at data collection, so how to approach elderly population, so which potential disability they may have, which type and which intensity, and how to collect such data by active data, passive data collection, and then policy recommendations. So that's why we have a circle here, because depending on the vulnerable users identified, we had specific policy actions and so on. It is interrelated aspects here. So these are the 3 cities we considered in the southwest of Sweden. And here are our main results. So basically, after investigating data from a survey from 2008, we found that especially boarding difficulty, the fact that bus stops as well were too distant from where people live, and fear of traveling, fear to fall, for example, were the most important aspects for bus cessation among elderly people in those 3 cities. So yeah, implications for equity and main conclusion from our research were that there are several levels in terms of policy actions in which we can play to change those variables which we have identified. So for example, at the planning stage, we could maybe shorten the distance to bus stops. At the tactical or operational stage, maybe play on the timetable of the bus operation or the more personal service on board. And finally, at the transport design parts, maybe to add equipment or boarding facilities. Thank you very much.
Our group looks at fairness in the domain of transport. We can assume that there's a relationship between the level of transport available for people, their accessibility level, and the level of their activity participation. If I have more transport options available, then probably my level of accessibility, the jobs I can reach, for instance, goes up. And therefore also my level of activity participation might go up. So I might be able to reach a job, get into employment and so on. That also assumes that if my level of transport goes down, if we cut back on public transport, for instance, my level of accessibility goes down, and that might also exclude me from that job and lead, for instance, to unemployment. There might therefore be a certain tipping point, a sufficiency line basically, where my level of accessibility is still enough, still sufficient, but below that I might be excluded from the job. We therefore use an accessibility fairness index derived from income poverty index that measures the depth of this accessibility shortfall, levels of accessibility that fall below the sufficiency line, and the prevalence of accessibility, so the number of people that are reliant on this insufficient level of accessibility. We basically identify 3 steps of analysis. The first one is measure this accessibility. Now, as our transport system is mainly organized around motorized transport, we distinguish between car and public transport accessibility. Second step is determine the people at risk. Now, the people that might be most reliant on public transport, which often offers a lower level of accessibility, are people in the lowest income quintile. So we use that as a proxy for the people at risk. And the third step is establishing the sufficiency line. This is the number of jobs that are necessary to be able to access them. And therefore we use a certain threshold of average car-based accessibility in the region, simply because we lack an empirical relationship between levels of accessibility and activity participation. We map this level of insufficient accessibility, you might say, in the Amsterdam metropolitan region. What we see is based on car peak accessibility levels, and off peak we see very high levels of accessibility per zones in the region, while for public transport here in the left down corner is very low. So we want to focus first of all on people that rely on public transport. We therefore identified 4 poverty lines, 4 sufficiency line, one of 50% of car-based accessibility, 40%, 30% and 20%. We see that most of the public transport zones that rely on public transport accessibility per sufficiency line fall below these subsequent poverty lines. We map the spatial patterns of accessibility poverty, and we see that the blue areas all fall below the sufficiency lines. In this case, the 50% sufficiency line, and the darker the areas are, the more people are reliant on this insufficient level of accessibility. We see with adopting a lower sufficiency line that the spatial pattern slowly moves outward. So the white areas are above the sufficiency line, the blue areas below. And we see concentrations in specific areas that are relatively low served by public transport and have high concentrations of low income groups that are reliant on this accessibility level and who might be most at risk of social exclusion. I come to the conclusions. Obviously, we don't know exactly to what extent people are excluded in these areas, but we do see that accessibility is not so much rural, but specifically concentrated in the suburban areas, so in the periphery basically of cities. Therefore, transport investments and policy should focus on these areas where levels are relatively low of accessibility and where the highest concentrations of low-income people live. And finally, we need obviously more specific analysis, both quantitative and qualitative, in which we know more about, for instance, the skill level of jobs available for people and to what extent it really excludes them. But with this kind of indicator, our fairness index shows us this spatial pattern of inequities.
In Workgroup 5, we evaluated the equity assessment of Tel Aviv's new transport plan. And the new transport plan is very macro and very accessibility focused. So equity isn't the main objective of the plan. but it's one of the criteria in the multi-criteria analysis. In the multi-criteria analysis, the government officials have weighed different perspectives, equity being one of them, but they have not involved other interest groups or local government. The plan looks at socioeconomically poor neighborhoods and look at how accessibility changes for those neighborhoods. But the transport model that Tel Aviv government use, or the Israeli government use, allows you to look at specific individuals. So we suggest as an improvement to the plan or to the assessment methodology is to look at individuals and then see how their accessibility change, and then identify the socioeconomic weak individuals among that population instead of looking at neighborhoods. We also suggest that the participation in development of the plan is improved by involving more stakeholders in the assessment.
So we're presenting results for working group 6, how to reshape transport policy. So our main concerns, things that we need to consider when we're including participatory approach to decision making. We had effective communication by policymakers and politicians to make sure that why we're making changes is clear to the population as large. We want to identify the needs of people and the underlying issues of the problems that are brought up by different groups in the population. And also we want to explore the benefits of the proposed solutions so that they're generalized to the general population and they're not special interest driven results only. So this would imply having a bottom-up approach where you have individual projects that are going to be impacting local policies that are going to be impacting regional and national policies. The planning process is a never-ending process, so we want input from the people at the beginning stage where they're really impacting the direction of the policy. And then that's going to impact when you start planning, and then you want to go back to the people with the results of your planning and your proposed plans, and you want to talk to them before you make a final decision, and then you want to have an ex post analysis of the results to make sure that what you tried to do, you could actually do. And again, people provide you input again, and you start planning for the next issue and the next problem that might arise. In the input, we want input from all sorts of cases. You want to look at case studies in other areas, but you really want to look at why things worked and not just how they worked. So that you can apply some things and some things you can't. You want special interest groups. You want technical input, but also you want to identify people that are disadvantaged and people that might be impacted negatively by a particular project and make sure you include them. So that has to be part of the planning process in any institution. Again, and when you're making decisions, you want to make decisions at 3 different levels. You want very micro level decisions for the project, but you also want this input to impact local programs. You want it to impact general policies, and you always want to educate people, because with these changes, we want to change people's behavior, and we want to change people's habits and how they interact with the city. So just to conclude, ex post analysis is very important. You want to see whether your projects actually work. A project is never over. You want to generalize your results so that they're not just special interest results, but there's something for the general population. And again, you want to include people in the policy direction, in plan-specific input, and also in the ex post when you're analyzing the results of your project. Thank you very much.